Hey there, and welcome to the first episode of Radically Curious, a show that focuses on extraordinary human beings, their experiences, achievements, and things to learn from them to live a better life. Thanks for joining us today to chat with Chris Messina, a person most known for literally inventing a hashtag and being at the forefront of all things technology and Silicon Valley. Chris was a volunteer at Mozilla Foundation, worked at Google, Uber, and consulted various technology startups on product design. Just a heads up, apologies for the sound and video quality. This is our first show, and there is definitely a learning curve to this. So thank you for your patience. Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of Radically Curious podcast. Apologies to everyone who's watching it 100 years from now and thinks that the name is quite stupid, but I feel it's very relevant to the current timing and the people that will be joining us on this podcast. So our first guest is Chris Messina. Yep. And he's most famous for inventing hashtag, but there are a bunch of different things that he's involved with. And in general, like you should Google him as Chris Messina Tech. And that's the only way I can find.
Not the actor, yeah.
Yeah, the Wikipedia page about him. And yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation about being radically curious.
So, and I guess the first thing that anyone that watches this episode would love to hear is the impact of inventing a hashtag on your life, and besides all things like publicity and all kinds of good things that came to your life in terms of that retroactive power of inventing a legacy that keeps going on and influencing our societies.
That's a great big question. I guess it's one of those things where I think you have to go back to the beginning and kind of understand a little bit about the original context to sort of have a feeling for why, on the one hand, this feels somewhat unprecedented, and on the other hand, is one of those things that if you get swept up in the momentum of history, I suppose, then you kind of get tagged along or brought along for the ride. And in this case, certainly as social media has become more mainstream, the trappings of social media itself become more prevalent in society and in culture, and in my case, language. And so, in the beginning of real social media, especially mobile social media, specifically Twitter, there was a great deal of skepticism that this type of thing would ever be useful, that would ever break out of kind of like the Silicon Valley like nerdcore scene. And yet there were many of us who were involved in that community that really believed in what we were doing. And Zuckerberg liked to talk about kind of connecting the world, or at least making the world a more open and connected place. And I think many of us had a similar desire and goal to use internet technology to bring people closer together, to bridge the gap, so to speak, to democratize the ability to participate in conversations, to no longer have to go through the conventional gatekeepers of publishers, of television, of radio, et cetera, where it cost a huge amount of money to even just show up. Suddenly now, if you had like a feature phone with an SMS plan, you could publish to the internet. And it really, I think, did provide an on-ramp to getting more voices out there. Now, looking back, in 2007, it was hard to imagine that sort of geeky idea like the hashtag would be something that like normal humans might ever pick up, but it was designed to be transparent and accessible. And even if you didn't really understand it, it was almost like a secret code or an incantation that would do something magical for you. And you could learn how to do it better just by watching and imitating other people. So I think for me, looking back, the thing that's really amazing is to, I think, consider the plasticity of language. That language is adaptive. It's constantly changing. It's adapting to the times. It's adapting to cultural context, to the mediums that exist. And for me, obviously seeing, just like the millions and millions of hashtags that are out there and recognizing that this simple shift of language, this little hack, has become so commonplace, I think is both like humbling and reassuring, because it sort of on the one hand shows you that depending on your timing and depending on your ideas and depending on your motivation and depending on like lots and lots of things, you may just, hit the ball just right to like really hit a home run, even though you might be the worst batter of all time. You know what I mean? Like there's just enough physics involved where it could happen. And so I kind of think that that's my experience, which in this moment, when so much of the world is in flux and changing, there is somebody or some group of people that are going to come forward with a different view of reality that says, what if the world were more like this? What if people could behave in this way and have this outcome? And then that story and that idea, because we're jilted and shifted and off of our center, allows us then to imagine that world as being reality, and then we start to behave as though it is. And suddenly, you wake up 15 years later and it is the world. And that's kind of what happened to me.
Yeah. But when you talk about, something so weird and so nerdy, like, and you're also a super humble guy in terms of creating something that keeps propagating, but don't you think that the interface is weird, but the innate desire and innate format have existed before in different forms? Like, even if you take the current context of like protests, all people have, the basically 140 characters on pieces of like cardboard and
Yes.
things like that, and slogans in a way, and all the things that happen throughout thousands of years and revolutions and all things attached to it, they kind of mimicked. Hashtag mimics that.
Absolutely. And it's important to recognize, like, I'm not in any way suggesting that I invented the idea for, like a label or for a rallying cry or, like the sound of a horn, to mobilize an army. Like, clearly, as you say, these ideas and these practices and these behaviors have been part of civilization, for a very long time. I think that the difference and the juxtaposition is between the physical world that's lived, in the world of atoms and the one of bits, and to then find a way of joining those two worlds in a way that is, I suppose, maybe like readable or transparent to both contexts. And what I mean by that is that you can see a QR code like on a sign or a billboard, but you can't actually read it with your eyes. You need to have a translation device. You need to have a phone or a camera to actually take that data in and then to turn it into a URL, which then opens up a web page through talking to a server. And there's this whole string of things that needs to happen. The thing about the hashtag, though, is that it works in written language. So on a sign at a protest, for example, and it also connects to two things: the idea of aggregating around a shared identifier or a phrase, in language, like let's all agree to call this hashtag Black Lives Matter. And then even if it's a bunch of random strings of characters or something, people will see it and then use it over and over again if it actually resonates for them in some way. And then if they use that token and they deposit it to the sort of internet slot machine, then it sort of will pull out all the other things that have also been tagged with the same token. So there's this coordination aspect that happens between the offline and the online that I think is probably the profound and different aspect of this, that it is a mechanism of both linguistic or humanistic language as well as digital language.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, like, obviously, the technology by itself doesn't mean anything without the context where it's applied. And as we all remember, QR codes didn't really take off, 10 years ago. Yep. But they're slowly picking up with, different interfaces to actually operate them. And, the same goes for different technologies back in the days. Like if you take Nikola Tesla, electricity, and all things attached, I do think that it is really about that resonance, and that for fans of quantum mechanics, about the collapse of wave function. Basically, there are so many ways to express yourself, and in point of time, there was a probability of you posting that initial tweet and suggesting that, hey, let's just use the hashtag, and boom, it all converged and people start using it. And that takes
that takes a good, solid serendipity, the coincidence, but also the universe randomness in a way. And we're definitely going to observe more and more such things. And I guess my next question to you is, what do you think is the most disruptive technology right now that has the most potential to impact human behavior?
Well, I mean, I don't know that you're gonna, like this answer per se, but I think curiosity is actually an amazing human technology. One of the things that I have, I guess, come to believe and to understand, and I traveled around the world last year talking about this idea, was that the concept that digital or physical technology is separate from us, I think is leading us astray. In other words, to imagine that the iPhone or our social media, social networks, or that our computers are somehow separate and divorced from us, and that they operate in their own kind of logic space, is ignoring the social context in which they exist. And as well, the way in which they affect the way that we behave, they affect the way that we think, they affect the shape of our thoughts. I remember when I was in the early days of Twitter, I'd be walking around, out in the world, literally composing tweets like in my mind, with 140 characters. It changed the shape of my thoughts. I was walking around, looking at the scenery, thinking how I would crop things into squares because of Instagram. So, right? So to imagine that these technologies and these mediums that we're creating are not also an expression, an extension of us, is to ignore a very important reality. And I think we're in a moment of really rapid evolution and change and growth in ways that we can't quite understand, anticipate, or predict, and that we have to be very flexible about it. And to me, that requires a curious mind, both a curious mind about the self and about the relationships that you have with everything else that's out there, whether it's other people or whether it's your devices, or just the environment that you find yourself in. And so unless you have that kind of infinite hunger, like to learn about and to be observant and to become aware of what's happening, I think you'll become overwhelmed. And it's very easy to shut down. It's very easy to tune out. It's very easy to become resistant and to reject what's happening as opposed to engage with it in conversation and dialogue, and to feel very disempowered. So I think curiosity to me is, I guess, the most powerful technology that we're not really talking about and necessarily teaching people, especially as they're growing up at school.
So how do you increase curiosity through technology? Because and I have my share of experience facilitating that through various organizations and companies. And my most recent experience is obviously with CoronaY, and people that are watching this episode that are part of CoronaY know that I'm very big on the idea that we as humanity haven't yet invented a technology to help us discover things that we don't know exist. And the reason why I think like that is because Google, in a way, is a search engine that lets us find things that we don't know, that we know exist. Like, let's imagine that I want to learn about sport cars. For me to, learn about them, I have to understand that there's a concept of sport cars. Otherwise, the only way I'm going to search for information is just cars. There's so much information about cars that the probability of me reaching the article about sport cars or learning about how much they cost and things like that is very, very low. So what do you think about that concept and how I'm not saying Google is not doing anything in that domain. They've recently introduced those people also ask questions,
Yep.
which add a healthy dose of curiosity into the mix. And I mean, Google started from I'm feeling lucky, which was the ideal kind of vehicle for curiosity, and it actually, I feel, created a bunch of startups that in the days like stumble upon. I used to spend so much time just like going through stuff that I didn't know even existed. And we kind of lost that intent to create companies like that because of the power that all of these companies have at centralizing the knowledge propagation, and also the algorithms in a way became they started working against curiosity and pro the actual business models of companies. Like I'm not bashing any of the ad monetization strategies, but if you think about how we discover knowledge in our little bubbles, like we always discover the things that will make us stick to the platform the longest. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's a lot, I think, in that statement. However,
Doing a lot.
One of the challenges of being a person that tends to live in the future, as I would suggest that you and I both do, is feeling the weight or the strain of similarity or familiar or sameness before a lot of other people will. And by that I mean that for many people, they're still getting into the moment where the idea that they can think of something that they want to learn about, let's say it's just cars, and then they can request it and get information back from tens of thousands of different resources or other individuals who have published information within seconds, is still novel, is still magical, is still mind-blowing. And we are beyond that point. We have matured into a point where we're like, well, yeah, whatever. Like, that's fine. Like, I take it for granted as part of my life. I do it 20, 50, 300 times a day. Yeah, well, and now we're saying we can become so refined and kind of dig into the fidelity of information with, I guess, so much more capability than even 4 or 5, 7 years ago, that now we're wanting more serendipity. We're wanting more discovery. We're wanting things to be put in front of us that we haven't ever tasted before, or that we haven't experienced or explored. And I think it's a really interesting. I see most things as existing on pendulums or on a kind of inhale exhale pattern. And so on the one hand, we moved in this direction of getting precisely exactly what you wanted, whereas before it was not possible because either the information didn't exist in digital form, or the algorithms weren't good enough, or your search queries weren't good enough, or the training data wasn't good enough, or it was too expensive to compute, whatever. We've moved past a lot of those limitations, and now we can get you just nearly precisely what you want. Well, that's very powerful, but as you say, then we end up in a kind of filter bubble or a kind of stasis where we're no longer growing, we're no longer expanding, because we're just seeing the same things over and over again. And you see this a lot in machine learning, especially I think if you think about recommendation systems, that unless you figure out the right kind of random seed aspect to, jump train tracks, if you will, from like one genre to another, like, I'm thinking specifically of Spotify, then you're going to actually find that experience to be deadening over time because it becomes repetitive. So then how do you introduce novelty into an experience while still anchoring to something that's familiar and known, so that you can bridge someone into that new context successfully? Because if you just throw things, like if you go from, unfortunately, I don't know enough like obscure genres to like make this work, but sort of like acid jazz to like, death metal or something, like that is not adjacent. That's far too abrupt, and it just feels like noise because you don't know how to appreciate what you're actually showing someone. So you kind of have to. I guess I think about it. I was having a conversation today with a friend of mine talking about negative space and about like focal lengths and about like, we're very used to kind of looking at the positive space, the things that we know how to see, and our focus has gotten really good on those things. But beyond what's in our positive view, there is negative space, and in that negative space are fuzzy shapes. And our eyes know how to, once we train them on something new, to hone in and kind of test different distances and different focal lengths until we arrive at something that is sharp and precise. And I think in a similar way, in order to encourage curiosity, you have to think about it from that perspective. How do you give someone something that's slightly new, a little bit different, fun to look at? Yeah, how do you bridge from where you are now and what's familiar and safe into something that's new and novel, that expands your perspective? And that, I think, we're just at the early days of that. And it's one of the reasons why I've gotten very excited about conversational computing, because it allows people to start to express themselves in their own language with their own understanding of things without using, let's say, the proper, quote unquote, proper words.
And that's an important factor. Sorry for interrupting you, because I started to reevaluate, because have you ever taught kids or very old people how to Google? Just a quick question.
I mean, I would say that I've observed both using voice computing and voice assistants, but I haven't tried to teach them how to type because many of them just get frustrated.
Yeah, and I've actually gone through that. And the thing that I realized only recently is the fact the reason why it's so hard, it's because people don't think that way. They
Yes.
don't think in keywords.
Right.
They think questions. They think in conversation. And again, it's very hard problem to solve in terms of like just having Google.
Well, but actually, I think it's a little bit different. And by that I mean that I know that when I was working at Google, which granted I left in 2013, so it's been a while, but that was at the dawn of the Google Assistant and the early days of that. And there was some data, if you go back, I think if you Google it, that starts to talk about how queries were starting to become longer. And one of the reasons why they shifted to voice search and why voice search was so important was because as people moved away from the desktop, where they were quite lazy and willing or used to typing a single keyword, that when you got onto mobile, typing was really annoying, it was really slow, it was really prone to error. And so just speaking into the device was a lot more efficient. And especially when you think about like the Asian audience, typing words in non-Latin characters is even worse. So speaking is a much more efficient way of actually getting what's in your mind into the computer. And as queries have become longer, like Google and other search experiences.
Fluid way, because
say it again.
I was saying fluid in a way.
Yes, exactly. So you're able to, and I think this is the conversational aspect or evolution of Google currently, is that it's a little bit more of a cast a broad net in a general topic, and then how do you narrow down, as opposed to, give me a page of 20 results, I'll read them quickly. Rarely will I go to the second page, just type a different query, do it again, over and over again. I think people are looking to, have a dialogue to say, well, that's not exactly what I mean. Maybe it's more like this, which to your point is why I think having those people also ask is a way of doing refinement to discover language that they didn't have before to arrive at an outcome that someone else has already figured out is actually the pathway to get to the desired result.
Yeah, because, and I'm an avid fan of voice computing and conversational voice apps. The problem that I have is, first of all, it works maybe like 60% of time for me because I tend to ask very complex questions and I always get frustrated because my questions are like, what is the guy that is like Serbian Elon Musk that created the electric vehicle? Mm-hmm. And then boom, like, sorry, I couldn't find that. And I'm like,
the fact that you have such high expectations is an example of how much searching has improved.
But like sometimes it works. Like the most recent one, I was very inspired by the book, Who You Are Is What You Do, the Ben Horowitz book about culture. And there's the prism of Haitian revolution in the Caribbean. And I forgot what was the name of the leader of that revolution. And I was like, hey, Google, who is the leader of Haitian revolution in, no, I just asked, who was the leader of Haitian revolution? And then he or it gave me a person that didn't resonate to me. And I was like, hold on, there were probably multiple revolutions. Let me clarify that. Who was the leader of Haitian revolution? And it worked. And sometimes like it really takes a couple of like clarifications. And at that point, there is a trade-off. Like at that point, if I'm not playing in bed and like not near a computer, I will still use voice. But if I'm at the computer, I will definitely type it in and try to find it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it just suggests that like we are in relationship with our technology, and it's changing us, and we're changing it, and it's this like technodynamic that is like really new, and I mean it's exciting and it's also terrifying because there's so much to be afraid of if we get certain things wrong. And I mean, one of the, of course, concepts in machine learning is reinforcement learning. And just as you do with a child or anybody really, repetition is kind of the way in which you ingrain something into your memory, into the way you process things. And so if we ingrain the wrong messages, if we have the wrong or mismemory of something that happened, biases, like I think it's really fascinating for us to be going through this process right now when we're talking about systemic racism, because if we are building artificial intelligent algorithms that make assumptions based on the way that the world is today, and that world is unjust, then we are going to program a world that is far more powerful and deterministic, that doesn't actually allow for that type of curiosity and growth, that actually takes a step back and thinks about the ultimate outcome and goal that you want to achieve, which should be or could be, the pursuit of happiness by the most number of people possible, or for people to find what their purpose is, to be, pro-socially engaged in their community and with themselves. But we don't have those types of goals yet. It's mostly been about industrialized goals or capitalist goals or property-based goals. And those goals are largely determined or come from a scarcity-based history. And so in the information world and in the internet, we are living with abundant economics, or the economics of abundance, and yet all of our instincts, at least from a human perspective, come from the opposite grain. And that concerns me greatly, because unless the people who are writing these algorithms and building these systems are able to think in that alternative modality and not merely to perpetuate the themes of industrialization and capitalism, then we actually may miss the whole point and opportunity that the internet presents us with.
Yeah, and the problem is, as you mentioned, if we build in biases into these machine learning systems with their own goals and objectives, we may end up with a very surreal and bad world that is governed by systems. In China, there is a very weird region where Uyghur people are completely controlled by AI, which is when I read that article, I was like, what's going on? Why it's happening? But if you think about it, there is a mix of human intent and statistical representation of data that is kind of driving us into the wrong direction. Because if you think about it, the statistics are very limited, and there is a difference between data and information. And for you to derive information, you have to have some context, and you have to understand the meaning of that data to be able to extract information from it. But if it's just statistical representation and claiming that, hey, people of this race tend to gravitate towards crime more, or people that live in Compton here in LA tend to be criminals, I guess it makes sense from statistics, but not from the actual meaning of the data. And you can't really classify and categorize people based on that. And that's why
you can, and people do. It just doesn't necessarily lead to the outcomes that you would want. And as you say, the statistics can describe a set of inputs or phenomena that exist in the world, but it doesn't help you to necessarily understand why or how things got to be that way. And I think the conversation now about policing and defunding the police departments is very interesting, because if you go back and you look at the history of the police, the system is working as it was designed. It just turns out that the reasons why it was designed no longer make sense in the modern era. And you could say sort of retrospectively or retroactively that they didn't make sense back then either. But of course, if you are a proponent of slavery, then they did make sense, and they were part of your system of ownership and property. And it's taken a long time for the humanitarian attitude to actually proliferate such that we understand, or an increasing number of us, not all of us yet, understand that humans and human beings are all of the same species. And what happens to any one of us happens to the rest of us. And yet we've come up with and invented these artificial ways of dividing ourselves, to pit ourselves against each other. In some ways, it seems as though because we've become disconnected from even the individual. And I think industrialization, it wasn't the start of it, but it certainly amplified it. It kind of took a lot of things that were going on for a long time about, again, scarcity mindsets, and amplified them over 100 years. And now we're living with the consequences of that, just as we're starting to build these algorithms that will determine the ways in which all of this abundance is redistributed, and whether or not that redistribution is actually fair and enfranchising a greater set of the human population or a smaller set.
Yeah, And it all comes down to the objective function.
Yeah.
The thing that not many people realize, but we as humans and as a society, we're kind of similar to reinforcement learning in a way, as in terms of group dynamics.
Yes,
Because
totally.
if you think about it, it's not that Facebook is bad or Google is bad. It's just their objective function is completely misaligned with personal interests and individuals in a way. And obviously, they produce a lot of positivity and impact to the world in a good, in a great way. But like, to give you a very simple example, the other day I installed a Chinese app just to play around. There was this new app called Billy or something, Billy. And I was curious about it, exploring the new TikTok or something.
Do you mean Zin? Zin is another new TikTok.
I don't know. There's so many.
Yeah, there's so many of them now,
Crazy.
And they're just like stealing from each other, and it's kind of amazing to watch.
Yeah, but I downloaded that app, and guess what? Since then, all the ads that I receive on Instagram are Chinese ads, and it's getting surreal. Like, I'm at the point of, like, how does it make any sense? Like, I was actually enjoying Facebook ads because they frequently show me the things that are relevant to me. Not that I'm buying all of them, but I'm learning from the perspective of, learning what's out there in terms of products. The fact that I'm like Googling crystals and like amethyst doesn't buy them, but I keep seeing all kinds of like.
You never know. I mean, long enough, it might be fine. You might, in terms of your lifetime value as a customer, it just takes one, and then you're going to be hooked.
Yeah, and that's actually a very interesting moment. Like, my behavior of using YouTube transformed in the past 5 years as the algorithms improved. So now I'm very, very cautious about things that I search for because I don't want to lose that those precious weights that fine-tune my preferences.
So this is interesting though, and I find this this sort of is making my point, right? Like, the technology, because of how you expect to behave, has caused you to change your behavior and to modify what you might otherwise search for, to actually dim your curiosity because you actually like where you're at. Now, what I find is interesting about this, it's to go one step further, is that Google and YouTube provide you with tools to express your interests, like, directly to them. You can just tell them, like, to their face, like, actually, I'm not interested in Chinese apps because I don't speak Chinese, or maybe I do, or like whatever it is. There is a dashboard for that. Now, I imagine it's a very low trafficked part of these websites, but it's there. And
I tried.
You tried it.
Yep. It's quite an interesting experience because you learn a lot. It becomes a really self-awareness exercise.
Yes.
But it's bound to ontologies that Facebook operates on.
So this is another good example, right? Like, I'm a big fan of Alan Watts, and he has this concept called the grid of words. And the idea essentially is that if you imagine graph paper with all the dots on it, that those dots, essentially you could imagine those representing words or labels that are in the human lexicon, but that all the white space around the dots is actually all the concepts that could exist or could be labeled. But as a result of both the simplicity of our minds and the efficiency of our language, we actually kind of reduce our awareness to a very small, let's say, corner of that graph paper. And so just as you say, these services and sites are programmed based on an ontology that exists and makes sense within somebody's frame of reference, which is itself a lossy set of all the possible things that you could have in there. And I find this very interesting. I spend a lot of time on Product Hunt, and there are categories that you can label or topics that you can post products to. And it says a lot that the category list was clearly set in like 2017 or 18, because a lot of the products that are in there and the topics that are present are no longer really that popular or that interesting. And that there's a whole set of categories that are just not part of it. And this is part of that growth and curiosity that needs to be built into these systems, where they learn over time what's relevant. And this is, I think, going back to like your first question, why I think the hashtag is a mechanism for tracking human interests and conversations is so useful. It's because it's non-deterministic. And in fact, it also has this built-in, cycle of life or death, where, and actually, this was so fascinating for me. It was, I think, last Tuesday. Um, last Tuesday, when we had the blackout day, essentially everyone sort of put all these squares in their Instagram profiles, with hashtag Black Lives Matter. And what happened was, as a result of all these people using that hashtag, we flooded out the normal messages that the Black community on Twitter, or I'm sorry, on Instagram typically uses to sort of coordinate amongst themselves. And I had several people ask me, can you please remove that hashtag from your post? And I was blown away. First of all, obviously, given my relationship with the hashtag, I was like, wow, someone is now telling me how to use hashtags. We've come full circle. This is really great. On the other hand, the fact that there was now this invasion of information, or maybe it's just data, that was overwhelming and overloading that circuit of conversation meant that there was this crisis or this moment where we were suddenly back into scarcity economics, that the algorithms weren't working because they hadn't prepared for this influx of new data sources. It was working just fine. It was an anomaly, exactly. And so that burst, obviously gives you this deep awareness of the size of that conversation and how many people are affected, for just random people to be coming into my posts who are not even following me and seeing my content and interacting with me through that tag. And what it meant was then suddenly, and I've seen this on Twitter in terms of the hashtag suggestions, that people start to fracture off into subtags or into longer tags, whether it's hashtag Black Lives Matter DC or hashtag Black Lives Matter Bay Area, whatever. They become more and more precise to resonate with a smaller subset of that audience. And that is something that these ontologies that exist or that are created by experts and that are set in stone and become ossified over time actually limit our ability to grow and adapt and to build curiosity into the very social media that defines our ability to have emerging conversations and to think about things in a new way. So I feel that is the challenge for the designers of this next generation of technologies to, one, recognize and support and cultivate curiosity within themselves so that they know how to see it and to observe it and to recognize where they have omitted it from the systems that they're designing and building. And then if a system that they build is automated and lacks that curiosity, lacks the ability to grow and to change over time, that they are actually curtailing human potential and our ability to continue to evolve and change and improve.
Yeah, kind of we have to make sure we bake in continuity of curiosity into whatever technology we're creating. Because, and there is also a limit to that, because we're still biological species, and we're limited.
We're sort of, what is it called? It's well, yes. I mean, we are biological, but we are also somewhat technological. But sure, cyborg. I think we're cyborgian. But yeah.
Yeah, and this is where it becomes interesting, because if you think about our ability to adapt biologically, we're very slow with that, and it's going to take another 1,000 of years minimum to change at least something biologically, if we don't get too crazy and install neural links in our brains, or CRISPR the stuff out of our brains and genes. But let's assume we won't, and let's assume that we actually have to evolve to be able to digest and understand all of these systems, to even comprehend the complexity of possible ontologies that exist there, that is not bound by statistical representation of data, because there might be, another entity or another concept that has a very, very small representation, but has such a big meaning for a person. For example, whenever I learned about the FIRE movement, which is financial independence, retire early, on Reddit, I was like, wow, this is amazing, that people are talking about this, but there was no way for me to even know that exists, and it's so insignificant in terms of statistics and all of the data that exists, that I would never find it, if not, I think, the trends, some trends newsletter that I observed, which brings me to the point that there is a dichotomy between our innate ability to create natural curation, which is kind of the sub-filters and bubbles that we use to navigate complexities, and our ability to accept that we need to meta-evolutionize, which is evolutionize through technology augmenting our ability and perception of reality.
Yes, I definitely, I agree with that. And I think it also maybe speaks to how the type of evolution that we're going to experience is no longer going to be restricted to just our biological evolution, which is part of my whole point. When I talk about the technology of better humans, it's really about recognizing what is technology and that we ourselves are technology, and that investing in the technology of curiosity and self-awareness and communication and self-knowledge are really, really important to building better external technologies. The technologies that we use every day that we swipe left and right on, we actually have to create better versions of ourselves first if we're going to have better technological products external to us, and that we're just going to continue replicating a lot of our own dysfunctions in those products unless we become more aware of it and we learn how to adapt to them and we build more slack into the system. And I don't mean obviously like the communication platform.
Yeah, but the self-awareness is that next level skill that I feel humanity has to adapt. And like it almost has to be taught in school, whatever
for sure.
schools will become. Like that's absolute necessity in the current world, because if you're not self-aware, you're bound to scrolling Facebook feeds all day long. Like if you're not self-aware, you're eating junk food. And it's not that you're willingly doing that. It's actually you're wired to do all of these things, unfortunately, by our, let's call it firmware and
yes.
our reptile brain.
Our wire.
Yeah, and the even amygdala hijacking is also a thing that many people don't understand, like when they react to certain things on emotions. And the only way to cure yourself, or like at least mitigate the impact of all of these things, is to employ continuous self-awareness. And I truly believe that the only way for us to meta-evolutionize is to actually create systems and tools and processes, whatever form they will take. And I'm curious what you think about the concept of personal assistance, and how what's your view on this on the fact that most of the personal assistant tools exist within the domain of big corporations that obviously optimize for different objective functions?
Yeah. Well, and then I've got to actually jet to another call, but
yeah, you have to.
2 minutes. So, one, I think like the problem of conversational assistance is, again, this maybe belief or assumption that they need to know everything. That the number of, I forget what it was. There's some statistics that says that I think it's like 40 or 50% of queries every day to Google have never been seen by Google before. So the fact that it's constantly changing and evolving to brand new circumstances, brand new contexts, brand new products, brand new lived realities of people. Not to mention like the number of languages that Google has now supports, means that it would be very, very difficult, I think, for smaller companies with a smaller data set, with less training, with less compute power, with less resources, to really be able to tackle these things. And I don't know, the internet came from the DARPANET, which came from the ARPANET, which was a government-funded, program to prevent the loss of communication during a nuclear war. And I don't see a similar effort really being undertaken for a kind of universal voice assistant, backend, where the government is collecting all of this data and then making it available for smaller companies to be able to create these smaller single-purpose agents. And yet, that kind of needs to be the place where we go next, because otherwise, it will be the large companies that have all the data, that have the training information, that have the security and all the rest to make sense of it, and then to produce these services and products. We are in the acclimation phase of these products, where I imagine that the types of things that they could actually do for us are probably quite complex. But you look at something like Google Duplex, and they started with scheduling a haircut and a restaurant reservation for you. Why? Because no one's going to die. It's not that tricky to get right or wrong, and it's something that everyone can kind of relate to. And so it is very much a boil the frog, type of experience, where in several years, we will be angry that like the DMV is not able to provide us with a voice-based interaction where we just call it up, we do a voice print. It's like, okay, you know, whatever it is that the qualifications are for, well, hey, that's probably irrelevant since we're not going to be driving anymore in a couple of years. But regardless, like the fact that the government apparatus that exists is so dysfunctional and is not encouraging, I suppose, more competition in that space, is going to be a real, I think, challenge to capitalist functioning over the next 20 to 30 years. So I don't really have a good answer for you, except to say that it's a very hard computational problem, and I don't know what other structures could exist that could like compete while creating a really, you know, positive user experience that takes into consideration all the things that we talked about when it comes to curiosity and expansion and learning and growth, while also offering a service that everyone, let's say within like a federal system, should have access to and would have access to.
Yeah.
So,
oh, beautiful future where DMV is automated and let's end on that note. Quite dystopian, right?
Something to hope for. Yeah, right.
All right, thanks, man. It has been fascinating. I really think that a lot of people will enjoy this conversation, and it's actually stimulating. And yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Well, thanks a lot.